So today we'll be tying a small white woolly booger. We're going to be tying this on a size 10 streamer hook. This is going to be one of my go-to guide patterns here once we start the guide season in Alaska. The salmon smolts will be starting their migration down the river towards the ocean about the time that the trout start biting. And that's one of the major food sources that those trout and the grayling will have during the first part of the season are those smolts. So this white woolly bugger I have found to be one of the best smolt imitations. It's a good, easy pattern to tie. You can tie up a bunch of them real quick. And it's more of that suggestive instead of an imitative pattern. And I always think those work a little bit better when you're trying to catch trout. I think that when you're trying to be too imitative, you are putting what you think that food source should look like into the fly as opposed to what the trout think it looks like. So if you have something that's more suggestive, the trout can kind of fill in the blanks and then they can interpret that food as whatever they think it should be. So starting out, I've got a size 10 streamer hook in the vise. I am going to put a brass bead on it. I tend to like the silver beads. I think they really kind of go along with this white woolly booger, but you could honestly use any bead. I think that the main reason I would use a bead at all is just to add a little bit of extra weight, maybe a little bit of flash, and I think that silver flash goes a little bit better with the white woolly booger. So I've got the size 10 streamer hook in the vise. I'm going to take my bobbin of 8/aught white unithread. I'm going to start building that body right behind the bead. I'm going to work my way towards the back. I'm going to cut off this little tag end right here. And I'm going to go all the way to the back of the fly, to the bend. Now I'm going to take some white marabou and I'm going to go ahead and put my tail in. Now when I strip my marabou, a lot of times you'll see people take the feather and lay it on the back of the hook and tie it in like this, which works, especially if you're trying to tie a bunch of them fast. But I tend to strip off parts of the marabou feather in little clumps, about sizes about like that, and then I layer them on top of each other. And I think that gives that fly a little more motion if you have layers of marabou as opposed to one big chunk. So I want my tail to be about the length of the shank. We'll go ahead and tie this in right here. I'm going to cut this flush. No, I don't want to cut back here towards the back. If I cut back here, by the time I'm done, I'll have this giant lump of all the butts of my marabou feathers, and then it's going to make my whole fly look disproportionate. So I'm going to cut it behind the bead. I'm just going to let it hang there, and you're going to see why in a second. I'm going to take a couple more of these clumps of marabou, ripping just little pieces off of that stem at a time so that I can layer a few of these sections of marabou. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to capture it back here in the back, but then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut it right behind the bead. I think that's actually going to be enough marabou for this fly. Got a couple layers there. It's going to have really good action. It's going to undulate and swim really well in the water. So now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to wrap over the tops of this marabou, the stems, all the way behind the bead. And now you can see what I did. It makes the whole body even. You don't have a big clump back here. It's spread throughout the entire fly, and you have a good base now that you can put other materials over the top of. So I'm going to go ahead and take some of this lateral scale. It's kind of a smaller lateral scale. We're going to take a couple pieces of that and have that go out the back of the fly. I'm going to have one on each side, so I'm going to cut off a piece of this lateral scale, maybe 1.5 inches or so long, 2 inches max. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to split this about in half. It's about right where my finger is, you can see it's half. I'm going to tie that half in on the side facing me. I'm going to really anchor that down well. So I've got one piece of flash going out this side. I'm going to invert my vise so you can see it here a little bit. I'm going to pull this other strand, pull it away from you towards the other side, and then just tie it down. So I take one piece of flash and I use it for both sides. Now it's not perfectly even, one side is a little longer than the other, that's just fine. I tend to find that the fish really don't care. You just add a little bit more flash to that fly. It helps it stand out. From here, I'm going to go ahead and take some silver ultra wire. This is in the brassy size. This is about right for this size of streamer. I'm going to go ahead and take off a chunk of that. I got a few inches here to work with. This is probably enough to tie several flies worth right here. I'm going to go ahead and tie that going out the back. But again, I don't want to tie that stem in the very end of that wire down here. I want it to go all the way to the base of the bead so that when I wrap over my entire shank, I anchor it down. I don't have a big lump at the back of my fly. Anchor that down pretty well. It's going out the back. I'm going to go ahead and take some ice dub minnow belly. You can use any kind of like really white, kind of flashy dubbing, because again, we're imitating that smolt and we want that to really stand out, and they're kind of that white grayish color. So I tend to find that the ice dub minnow belly or the white ice dub tends to work really well. So I'm going to take some tufts of this and I'm just going to dub it right onto my tying thread. Very nice little dubbing rope there. And I'm just going to work my way forward. Try to get it fairly even, tapered bodied all the way up. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to go wrap over the top of this with a hackle feather. And then we're going to counter wrap that hackle feather with the silver wire that we put on. So it doesn't have to be perfect. All I'm doing is just building that body. One thing I noticed last year is that these flies that I was tying for the guide season to imitate these smolt tended to be a little bit of a skinnier woolly bugger, and they actually outfished some of the woolly buggers that we had that were a little bit thicker. And I think that these smolt that the trout are eating tend to be a little bit skinnier and narrow profile. They don't like the bigger, bulkier profile flies. So that's one thing to look out for if you're tying these to imitate the smolt. Not to say that a bigger, chunkier smolt won't work, but it just seemed last year they liked the little bit thinner profile. So I've dubbed all the way to the base of my bead here. Now I'm going to take a really small fiber. So there's small fibers on this hackle feather, and this is about perfect. So when I wrap it, it's going to have about the right proportional length of that hackle. And again, I just had to find the right hackle from a cape that I had. And sometimes you kind of have to search through and find the exact right size for the size fly that you're tying. So I went ahead and I cut it right here. I don't want this floofy stuff. I want it to start right about here in length. And the stiffer fibers, I want that concave side down. You can see how dull that is compared to the top side. And it's going to help with that concave side facing back and down to help wrap it. I'm actually going to shove that stem up into the bead if I can. It really help anchor it in there. I'm going to capture it with my thread. Take some good wraps there. Now I'm going to take my whip finish tool. I'm just going to do a couple whip finishes because now I'm going to use the rotating feature of my vise. And if I don't capture that in with a couple whip finishes, this hackle feather could very easily come out because my thread would unwrap. So now I'm going to take a pair of hackle pliers. I'm going to grab down here at the end of this feather. I'm going to do a couple securing wraps at the head, and then I'm going to take even wraps going all the way back to the end of the fly. Making a nice body with that hackle. Now I'm going to get back right here to the back of the fly. I'm just going to let that hang down. Now, since I wrapped this feather kind of coming towards me, I'm now going to take this silver wire while my hackle pliers are still hanging to keep it secured, and I'm going to wrap the opposite direction. So I'm coming towards me this way. And this is going to help to really secure these, or actually say this hackle feather down. I'm just taking evenly turns. I'm going over the tops of this feather so that once the fish hit it, once it gets fished for a while, it's going to hold that feather down and keep it from unraveling in the middle or tearing off completely. And after a while, you will have your hackle feathers kind of get messed up and come apart, but at that point you should be a couple fish in. Now that this is nice and secure, I'm just going to take my scissors. I'm going to cut that little tuft off the end there. Boom. And then you saw me capture this wire with a few wraps. I'm going to pull these feathers back, and I'm just going to helicopter this wire off so I'm not dulling my scissors by cutting it. That comes off. I'm going to pull these hackles back. Do a couple hard wraps there, making a head. Now I like to do 2 sets of whip finishes. I don't like to use head cements. I will use epoxies on certain patterns, but I don't like to use head cements. So I'm going to do 1 set of about 4 whip finishes here. Tie it off, and then I want to take another little tuft of this same ice stub minnow belly dubbing. Dub just a little bit on my thread. And then do a couple wraps right there behind the bead to kind of cover up those thread wraps in the head that I made with my whip finishes. Then I'm going to take my whip finish tool. I'm just going to do maybe 2 or 3 more whip finishes right behind the bead. Cut it off, and boom. You have a really simple white woolly booger. It imitates those smolt patterns really well. It's got a little bit of flash in it, both in the tail and in the body, and that's really going to help to attract those fish. You can fish this as a streamer being swung on a sink tip. I like to fish them under an indicator with a little split shot in front of it, and you can either strip that in or dead drift it, or I like to down hang it into log jams where those salmon smolt really seem to hang out. So that's an easy to tie white woolly booger. You can whip those out really quick. You can do some in black. You can do them in a duller white with no, it can be even flashier. You can make them bigger. And you can kind of play around and see what the fish like. This is one of my favorites, the white woolly booger, to imitate the salmon smolt on their migration downstream. Trout and grayling love them.